Channel now
In
delves into
1555, in an obscure corner of France, Nostradamus began to write a series of mysterious verses, full of strange ideas. Now it's claimed these were astonishingly accurate predictions of future events. Predicting cataclysms and disasters hundreds of years before they happen.
Nostradamus stands head and shoulders above the other prophets and seers.
He has been credited with virtually predicting the entire world history since his death up to now and well beyond.
But who was this extraordinary man? And were his verses really the most accurate prophecies ever told? We like to think we live in a rational scientific age, a world away from medieval superstition. That view, though, was challenged by the events of September 2001.
Holy. My God! Oh my God! Jesus Christ!
9/11 was the most shocking event in recent history. But in its immediate aftermath, millions turned not to science or rational explanations. They sought out instead the words of a long-dead prophet. On the internet in the days after 9/11, the name that received most searches wasn't Osama bin Laden or George Bush. It was Nostradamus. The idea that Nostradamus could help shed light on recent events may seem absurd, yet that's exactly what his supporters claim. Nostradamus' reputation hangs on the almost 1,000 four-line verses or quatrains he wrote. These are full of cryptic references. But to believers in Nostradamus, they are actually a secret code which predicts all manner of future events, including 9/11. Mario Redding is one of the foremost supporters of Nostradamus. When it comes to 9/11, he believes it's foretold in detail.
A fire from the center of the earth will shake the towers of the new city. As a result, two great rocks will fight a long war. Until Arethusan Springs bloody the river afresh. Well, every line has links to the 9/11 disaster there. Fire from the center of the earth, that's the petroleum that was the basis of the explosion, will shake the towers of the new city is more or less self-evident, but the new city was in the new world, and Nostradamus was fully aware of this at the time. Two great rocks are the two great rocks of Christianity and Islam, which will fight a great war, and a long war which will continue for many, many years. This, I have to say, impressed me enormously.
Redding believes Nostradamus' verses predict everything from the Great Fire of London through to Hurricane Katrina. Others disagree and think Nostradamus' words are being misused by his supporters.
They know that none of it's true, but it's just an easy way of making a living.
So was Nostradamus a prophet or not? Nostradamus was born in 1503 in Provence in southern France. It was a troubled time.
When you look around at actual living conditions for Nostradamus in Provence, as with everywhere in Europe, it was absolutely filthy. People never washed. The church preached against bathing. They were covered in lice, spent most of their daylight hours scratching. It was a short life of squalor and superstition, where death haunted every living moment.
From the start, Nostradamus was marked out as different.
He came from Jewish stock, which meant really he was in the second tier. His grandparents had probably been Orthodox Jews who had actually converted to Christianity. But even so, people would always remember. He would have been worried about the church watching his every move.
Nostradamus' early life, though, seems remarkably mundane. By his 20s, he'd married, settled down, and trained as a doctor. He even opened his own apothecary shop.
You have to imagine it's like being something between a grocer and a pharmacist. Anything from sweets and candies, wax, all kinds of stuff. Pharmacy shops were great places for gossip. Gambling took place there, lots and lots of betting on things like whether a baby was going to be born male or female. All that kind of predictive stuff certainly takes place in pharmacy shops.
By the end of the 1530s, Nostradamus was just another happily married shop owner. But then something happened which set his life on a very different path.
I think there's no doubt that the death of Nostradamus' wife and children in the plague outbreak at Agen had a profound effect on him. And I think it did trigger something in him, because it was from that moment that he started seeing his revelations.
Stricken by grief, Nostradamus set out on a journey through Europe. For over a decade he traveled, absorbing the ferment of new and occult ideas spreading across the continent. From Jewish mysticism to astrological techniques. When Nostradamus returned to Provence in the 1550s, he was ready to publish his greatest work. The Prophecies, a book that would change history. In 1555, the book appeared which would in time make Nostradamus famous across the world. The Prophecies. 942 dire predictions of terrifying events to come. Before Nostradamus, there had been many seers prophesying doom. He, though, was different, for he had access to a thoroughly modern invention.
But of course, the great technological breakthrough in the Renaissance was the printing press. Suddenly it was possible to produce printed books on a vast scale and disseminate them right across Europe. So extraordinary, radical and ludicrous ideas and brilliant ideas simultaneously could flood into all the houses of those who were fortunate enough to be literate.
It's probably one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing industry of the period. The printers are very keen to find bestsellers, and that has a very strong influence, of course, on the popularity of astrology, prophecy and the like, because these books often sell in very large numbers.
This is the perfect time, and this is a chance for a man to use this brand new information technology. His work will be disseminated right across Europe. Had he been born 100 years earlier, it would have remained stuck in Provence if he was lucky.
It wasn't just that Nostradamus' work circulated more widely than his predecessors. His language was of a different order, too.
Nostradamus, his great popularity is due to the fact that he found this very special style.
La grande cité sera bien désolée.
It is like a raw form, the raw visions coming directly flowing from his mind and put into very strange, crooked and hard to understand poetry.
Le lion jeune, le vieux surmontera. Par singulier duel, père, dans cage d'or, peste, qu'un en peuple mourra.
Everyone thought that this man really had a glimpse into the fate of mankind.
Nostradamus' dark style seemed designed for his troubled age. When he returned to Provence, war between the Catholics and the Protestants had reached fever pitch, with each side calling the other the Antichrist. The sense that the end of the world was nigh spread across France.
Nostradamus seems to be a man for bad times, really. So you get what seems to be a fit between his generally rather depressing view of the world and what's going on around you.
Despite his initial success, Nostradamus might not have become truly famous. But then the most important person in France read his work.
This extraordinary Italian queen of France, superstitious to her fingernails, was looking out for people who could show her the future. She'd heard of Nostradamus, and so she really plucked him from provincial obscurity to Parisian fame.
Catherine de' Medici, the Queen, summoned Nostradamus to the royal court.
You've got to remember, of course, that this was the most sparkling court in Europe at the time, and this really was. The French court was really beyond equal.
There, one quatrain in particular, it said, troubled the Queen. And no wonder. It seemed to predict the death of her husband, King Henry II of France. For supporters of Nostradamus, this verse is crucial. For it was, they say, the very first time Nostradamus successfully predicted the future.
The quatrain that really made Nostradamus' reputation was the quatrain about the death of Henry II, which was published a full 3 years before the death actually occurred.
This is when Nostradamus stands head and shoulders above the other prophets and seers.
Le lion jeune, le vieux surmontera. En chambelli,
The young lion will overcome the old one in a single combat on a military field.
dans cage d'or, les yeux lui crèvera.
Inside a golden cage, his eyes will be
Deux
pierced.
classes une, puis mourir.
2 wounds shall result from one blow, and afterwards he'll die a painful death.
The young lion was Montgomery, the commander of the king's bodyguard. And Montgomery asked the king if he would like to joust against him. And the king, being a virile, proud king, still quite young, said yes, despite Catherine de' Medici, his queen's, begging him not to go on the jousting field.
The king insisted. The first 2 passes, Montgomery managed to avoid him and his lance shattered.
The queen then came up to the king and said, please don't do this again. The king insisted, despite Montgomery's reservations. And at the last moment, Montgomery tried to raise his lance, but the lance splintered on the king's helmet.
The shattered ends of the lance pierced the king's eyes and his throat, and he took 9 days to die in agony.
And he died exactly as Nostradamus predicted, and it basically changed the history of France.
Nostradamus became a revered soothsayer. The Queen gave him a state pension, and he settled down into a form of comfortable retirement. On his death, Nostradamus was famous only in France. But his fame soon began to spread across Europe. In 1666, after the Great Fire of London, some people pointed out that there was a verse in Nostradamus' prophecies that seemed to predict it.
The blood of the upright will be absent from London. She will burn up suddenly in the year 66. The old lady will fall from her high place. Many other Protestant churches will be destroyed too. Suddenly in the year 66, well, that's dead on the nail with 1666. The old lady who falls from a high place is St. Paul's Cathedral, which was burnt and utterly destroyed in the fire.
By the 20th century, Nostradamus' status as a global superstar of prophecy was taken for granted. Every great event in history, it was being claimed, was foretold by him, including some of the darkest of all.
Well, there is the famous Nostradamus quatrain number 224, which appears to mention Hitler, virtually by name. Best farouche de fin fleuve traîné, with the hunger of wild beasts they will cross the rivers. Most of the world will be against Hister. The great man will find himself paraded inside a cage of iron. The German child understands nothing. So you have both German and Hister mentioned in the same quatrain.
In fact, so convinced were the Nazis themselves by Nostradamus, they actually used this verse in their propaganda.
The Nazis said that Nostradamus predicted the victory of the Germans in France. And when the Germans entered France at Sedan, they threw these pamphlets off from airplanes, and the French, who believed a lot in Nostradamus, they fled towards the southeast of France, leaving the streets to Paris free from refugees, and the Germans could advance much further to Paris.
After the war in Europe, Nostradamus' reputation went from strength to strength. Each new and terrifying historical event was credited to him. Including the atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
By the ports in two cities, two flails, never seen till now. Hunger, plague inside the body, people burned by strange metals. Now every line has something to tell us. By the ports in two cities, both of those cities were port cities. Two flails, never seen till now. Well, the flails are the atomic bombs, something that has never been seen before until that moment. People burned by strange metals, the heavy metal used within the bombs.
Not even the assassination of JFK, it's claimed, had escaped his notice.
From on high, evil will fall on the great man. A dead innocent will be accused of the deed. The guilty one will remain hidden in the mist.
To supporters of Nostradamus, the evidence seems overwhelming. He predicted the whole of history, they say, and his work is an unparalleled triumph of prophecy.
What Nostradamus offered both to his own people and to us was that magic mirror which would show you what was round the corner.
But there's just one awkward problem for Nostradamus' supporters. Nothing in science supports the idea that it's possible to see into the future. So could he have found a mysterious way around that? At the heart of his method of prophecy were his visions.
Nostradamus was convinced he did have divine inspirations, or to have paranormal abilities, precognitive visions, or whatever you want to call them. He even said that in his family it was widespread that people from his ancestors had also visions similar like he did. He thought that this was an inherited ability.
Ever since the oracles of the ancient past, shamans and seers have claimed to be able to see visions. Most have used techniques to trigger them. Nostradamus had his.
he would go into a room where there was a bowl of darkened water, often with ink, and he would then have his dreams or his revelations, looking into that water for very long periods of time.
Some have claimed that with his knowledge of plants and herbs, Nostradamus might even have induced his visions. What we do know is that once he had his visions, Nostradamus then used occult learning to interpret them. His family were converted Jews. His grandfather seems to have introduced the young Michel to the mysteries of the Jewish Kabbalah.
Kabbalah is a Jewish mystical tradition. Most people believe stretching back to the time of Moses when he was on Mount Sinai. He received the 10 Commandments, which he gave to the people. He also received mystical teachings, which were just kept secret. They were passed down to the initiated from father to son or from master to disciple. This here is a 17th century mirror of mystical Kabbalah, in which we have the number 72 here, 72 numbers. 72 was the number of angels which were most significant for Kabbalah. Each angel has a different concern. For example, here we have the Latin word amor, love. If you want to have assistance with that, you invoke a particular angel. The next one is sapientia, wisdom. Again, if you want wisdom, you invoke a different angel. Here we've got the Archangel Michael listed, which was particularly significant for Michel de Nostradamus. In fact, there's a famous letter, one of the most famous letters of Nostradamus, when he talks about invoking this angel who comes to him and gives him dream revelations.
He also steeped himself in one of the most important fields of study in the 16th century, astrology. Nowadays, the idea that stars and planets can influence our lives is often dismissed as nonsense. In Nostradamus' era, it was respectable.
Astrology at that time played a very important role. On the one hand, the intellectuals, they regarded astrology as a most important science in order to understand man's life on Earth, man's place in the universe, and also, to some extent, to understand the walks of history.
At the heart of astrology is the idea that history repeats itself. Nostradamus studied historical events. He learned what patterns of stars and planets coincided with those events. He then assumed that when these astronomical patterns happened again, similar events would happen again too. Of course, like astrologers today, Nostradamus would have needed to use a great deal of intuition.
When you get to the art of astrology, it's astrological interpretation. How do you interpret this? And you would look at the chart and you would start to string words together and suddenly see, oh yes, well if Jupiter is in this position, that person's going to be very lucky. If Jupiter is in this position, this person is going to be known successfully internationally. Jupiter in this position means they're going to be a wastrum. If you bring the intuition in, you will start to get little pings. Well, actually that. Because Venus is love or money. Now, the Venus in that chart, therefore, is it more geared towards love or is it more geared towards money? So there are nuances that you can only get, I believe, through that intuition.
There is no evidence that any of the ways that Nostradamus used to interpret his visions, such as astrology, actually work. And plenty of evidence they don't. For critics, this fatally undermines Nostradamus.
What I say to the supporters of Nostradamus is tell me what's going to happen with some degree of accuracy in the future. Tell me next year, 10 years, 50 years. Tell me when the world wars are actually going to happen. And if those predictions come true, then I'll be impressed.
No, I think Nostradamus was a complete and utter charlatan. And the whole thing is complete and utter mumbo-jumbo.
So do the strange verses of this long-dead author really refer to the events it's claimed they do? For hundreds of years, people have claimed that Nostradamus made eerily exact predictions of future events. There is one thing that unites all these claims. They have all been made after the events happened. No one has been able to use Nostradamus to make a successful prediction before an event has happened. Which doesn't mean to say that people haven't tried.
There was a verse in Nostradamus' prophecies which referred to the 7th month of 1999.
In the year 1999 and 7 months, from the sky will come the King of Terror. He will bring back the King of the Mongols, and after, war reigns.
It spoke of Roi de Frayeur, the King of Terror.
This is frequently assumed to mean that there's going to be a King of Terror coming from the sky. In 1999 it was assumed to be the Antichrist, or perhaps a comet, or perhaps any number of horrors you might care to mention.
Across the world as the day approached, people claimed Nostradamus' verse was bound to come true.
There was a panic, a real panic, because it seemed to be referring to the end of the world.
Stock markets dipped, and in some countries shops were stripped bare. In France, the noted designer Paco Rabanne was so convinced the end of the world was nigh, he cancelled his major Paris shows.
Nostradamus qui ne s'est jamais trompé. Jamais.
However, the 24th of July came, and then went. And the world didn't end. Nostradamus experts then recalculated, and a new date was set for the 11th of August. But there was no apocalypse. So why not? What this episode reveals is one of the biggest problems about using Nostradamus to make predictions. The texts of his works are full of errors. The entire 1999 prediction hung, for example, on the word défrayé, or King of Terror.
When this verse is examined with a knowledge of 15th, 16th century French, and when the first edition of Nostradamus's printed quatrains is also examined, there is no apostrophe between the D and the E in défrayeur. So the Roi de Frayeur with no apostrophe simply means a good, kind, generous king, a man like King Wenceslas in the Christmas Carol.
It turns out that over the years, Nostradamus' words have constantly been changed and added to. And the very technology which popularized his work added errors. Peter Le Mesurier has made a detailed study of the original quatrains.
It's very difficult to find even 2 copies of a single edition that are exactly the same, because the whole thing was printed by hand. Print fell out of its frames while it was being printed. Adjustments and corrections were made as you were going along. So as a result, quite a lot of words got misprinted. Very often the word de, meaning two, got printed as de apostropheeux, meaning of them, or the other way around. Or dame, meaning lady, got printed as de apostrophe ame, meaning of soul. Then when it came, for example, to unfamiliar words, unfamiliar place names that the printer had never heard of, he just did his best with them, and sometimes they didn't even approximate to what the original was.
Undeterred, Nostradamus' fans maintain some quatrains can be relied upon. Lionel Fanthorpe firmly believes that one verse predicts a famous French war hero.
3 times, one who is named de Gaulle will be the leader of France. And if we think of General Charles de Gaulle, a very valiant leader during the Battle of France, and then again he led the Free French against the occupying German forces. And finally there was his famous presidency from 1958 onwards. So that 3 times a leader named de Gaulle will lead France.
But Peter Le Mesurier thinks this is an example of another problem with Nostradamus: mistranslation.
It's quite common among people who don't understand Nostradamus' French to say, well, there must be some deeper meaning. Even people who know French are sufficiently unfamiliar with 16th century French to have to do that, or people who know 16th century French are unfamiliar enough with Nostradamus' way of using 16th century French. It's a counsel of desperation when you don't understand what's there.
He thinks the text really refers back to the ancient Roman Empire.
Verse says, Hercule le roi de Rome et Danemark, de Gaulle trois Guillons surnommés. Actually, all he's saying is de Gaulle trois, of the three Gauls. Julius Caesar had described Gaul as being divided into three parts. So all a translation should say of that is, from Rome to Denmark, Hercules shall be surnamed the leader of tripartite Gaul. Now you can read de Gaulle into that if you like, but you're stretching it a bit.
So with all this ambiguity, what does this mean for some of the most famous Nostradamus predictions of all? Are they any more reliable? One of the most famous foretells the rise of Hitler, or so it's said. But how credible is this, since the name in the verse is not Hitler, but Hister?
He's reputed to have thought, or at least pronounced, that a man called Hitler will come popping out of Germany and cause a lot of trouble. In fact, he goes to great lengths to explain that the word he uses is Hister, which in fact is the old Latin name for the lower Danube, so although the words are similar, one cannot get one from another.
Whereupon, of course, the nutters will come back and say, but he was born quite close to the Danube. So you could actually never win with this sort of thing.
But if Nostradamus meant Hitler, then why didn't he just say so? His fans say he had to be deliberately imprecise, and for a very good reason: the Inquisition. And that as a converted Jew, Nostradamus therefore had to be very careful about what he said.
One of his dangers living in the 16th century was that he was under suspicion from the Inquisition, and they were very brutal when they arrested and then executed their victims, and so Nostradamus was trying to cover his tracks.
Nostradamus was only really a minor irritant, if any, to the Inquisition, because they thought he might cross that thin dividing line between what was considered perfectly normal astrology and incredibly dangerous magic. So it was a very thin line. But really, I don't think he was high on their shopping list. I mean, there were plenty of other decent Protestants to get hold of and burn, so why bother with this rather wayward character from Provence who was just claiming to be a bit of a soothsayer?
There probably was no need to turn words like Hitler into a secret code like Hister. There is, though, a more obvious flaw with the famous Nazi prediction.
Best farouche de faim, with the hunger of wild beasts they will cross the rivers. Most of the world will be against Hister. The great man will find himself paraded inside a cage of iron.
The Nazis claimed it predicted their victory. But they actually lost the war. This has proved no obstacle to supporters. They now claim that all along it was meant to predict exactly that.
Now this quatrain is fascinating because it not only shows what is going to happen to Hitler, but also to Mussolini, who ended up being hung upside down in a cage of iron, i.e. a burnt-out garage near Lake Como in Italy with his mistress. The hunger of wild beasts, they will cross the river, refers to the Russians who crossed the two rivers to get to Germany. The German child understands nothing implies they did not understand what would happen to them as a result of following Hitler. So I think the quatrain holds together pretty well.
Nostradamus' words, it seems, can be constantly reinterpreted as events change. The problem is that he hardly ever put a date on his predictions. And when Nostradamus did put a date, he tended to hedge his bets. The Great Fire of London prediction, for example, doesn't say 1666, the year of the fire. It merely says 66. Critics say this vagueness increases the chance that events will seem to fit a verse, and the laws of probability mean that even unlikely events will eventually happen, if you give them enough time. Richard Wiseman is one of Nostradamus' fiercest critics.
So we're going to play Nostradamus roulette. In normal roulette, you place your money on a number, there's a single spin of the wheel, and if your number comes up, you win. But Nostradamus, when he made his predictions, didn't say when they were going to happen. So in this version of roulette, you choose a number and then you keep on spinning the wheel until you win.
Like a gambler, Nostradamus was relying on the odds going down over time.
No. Hey, red 23. Exactly as I predicted. So there you go. That's the great thing about Nostradamus roulette. If you give it long enough, you always win.
Sometimes, though, a verse of Nostradamus seems to fit an event so perfectly and spookily it's tempting to ignore such logic. So what does this mean for the eeriest prediction of recent times? The one about 9/11.
A fire from the center of the earth will shake the towers of the new city. As a result, two great rocks will fight a long war. Until Arethusan Springs bloody the river afresh.
This is what supporters say.
Well, every line has links to the 9/11 disaster there. Will shake the towers of the new city is more or less self-evident, but the new city was in the new world, and Nostradamus was fully aware of this at the time.
Critics, though, say this is simply a misinterpretation of Nostradamus.
There's no reason why new cities should be New York. There are lots of cities in the world with new at the front of them. Quite a lot of them actually mean new city, and the major one is Naples, which comes from Greek Neapolis, meaning new city, and it's what Nostradamus normally means by new city.
The fire from the center of the earth, that's the petroleum that was the basis of the explosion.
This is the major eruption of Vesuvius, Mount Vesuvius, next door to Naples, in the early 11th century, at a time when the Normans were invading southern Italy from Sicily.
So why would Nostradamus write a verse about an eruption near Naples which happened well before he was alive? The answer lies in his method of prophecy. As an astrologer, he always began by studying very specific events in the past. Then, believing history was cyclical, he assumed similar events would occur again. In other words, Nostradamus' verses refer primarily to events not in his future, but to those in his past. And that's true of all his verses, including those thought to be about 9/11.
And what one needs to do in looking at a verse like this is to say, well, what is it referring back to? Because virtually all Nostradamus' verses are referring back to historical events or whatever.
So what about the quatrain that it's claimed made Nostradamus' name? The one about the joust. The one that's claimed was his very first successful prediction.
The young lion will overcome the old one. hand to hand on the field of combat.
Nostradamus himself, during his lifetime, never ever thought that this Quatrain predicted the death of Henry II. We know from correspondence with other persons that he had that he actually selected a totally different Quatrain, not the Quatrain that every one of the interpreters think is one of the most famous examples of how right Nostradamus was.
In fact, when you look at that verse, 135, you'll see that in fact it can't really apply. It says it happens on a battlefield. It didn't happen in a battlefield. It talks about 2 fleets or 2 armies. There weren't 2 fleets or 2 armies. Whereupon, of course, people start twisting the words. This is the standard method with Nostradamus. You twist the words, or you twist the events, or indeed you twist both. And this is what most of the current Nostradamus industry is based on.
Human beings have a fathomless appetite for superstition, cant, hypocrisy, nonsense, and general rhubarb. And he is their great prophet, really.
It seems certain that Nostradamus didn't successfully predict 9/11, Hitler, or indeed anything else. Does that mean he is completely irrelevant now? Not according to Mario Redding. He says he can use Nostradamus to tell us what is going to happen in the future.
This is a controversial quatrain that appears to suggest the assassination of a world leader.
Mr. President!
Apparently, President Bush faces a deadly threat. In an apparent age of science and reason, Nostradamus is more famous today than ever. Perhaps there's a psychological explanation for his enduring popularity.
There'll always be a market for soothsayers and prophecies of various kinds. Paradoxically, I think the amazing march of science makes people even more keen to go back to the supernatural. People find science and the overwhelming amount of knowledge we have now actually quite frightening. And something that they can kind of understand, some secret book, somebody who knows more just by magic, is appealing.
If you look at the latest surveys into paranormal belief, into belief in prophecy and precognition, still about half of the population think it's possible. So even though we're surrounded by science and technology, we still buy into this idea that some people have the ability to see into the future. And I think that simply makes us feel good. It also adds a sense of mystery to the world. Suddenly science can't explain everything.
Despite his psychological appeal, there's no evidence Nostradamus was a prophet. And the only thing that would ever convince his critics would be if someone could use him today to make a prediction before an event. Mario Redding is willing to do exactly that.
One is taking quite a risk in predicting things for the future through a reading of Nostradamus, but I think in the case of certain quatrains, it seems to be pretty categorical. Because they disapproved of his divorce, a man who later they considered unworthy, the people will force out the king of the islands. A man will replace him who never expected to be king. I think we can assume that it's about Charles. It is not William who follows his father, but possibly Harry. Now, why that should be, I have no idea. Nostradamus doesn't make it clear.
Mario Redding says he has an even more troubling prediction.
This is a controversial quatrain that appears to suggest the assassination of a world leader sometime from 2006 onwards. The quatrain reads, "The successor will avenge his handsome brother." He will take over the realm under cover of vengeance. The obstacles slain, his dead blood seethes. Well, in line 2 here, we have one of the classic Nostradamian codes, which is sous ombre, which is beneath shelter out in a desert, i.e. under a bush. So my reading of this is that there may be an assassination attempt on President Bush. And in this context, if that were to happen, Nostradamus also foresees a pretty grim aftermath.
If this prediction doesn't come to pass, it may have an effect on Mario Redding's reputation, but it probably won't affect that of Nostradamus.